Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. So we're on the home stretch with this project at last. All that remains is the final details. As you can see, the Huntress's head is well and truly attached to her shoulders, and the only details that remain are just a few finishing touches and the base itself. So to start with, let's get to work on the base, it being the most prominent and largest unfeatured feature on the model. So to start with, we're going to use this opportunity to do a bit of experimentation with our techniques. My normal techniques for basing rocks is just German grey, a medium grey overbrush, and then a final sky grey highlight, a dry brush. Since the rocks themselves are a lot more flat and larger, I'm going to start with a base color first. So we're going to put on some cold grey from Vallejo Game Color. Now, we're establishing our initial, our main grey. This is our darkest tone basically, but it won't be in our necessarily be our darkest in our final effect. What this is just establishing a color to work with at this point. Anyway, this point is relatively simple. Just layer on the color until you've got an even coat, and that's that. So we're done with our first layer of, our main layer, and now we're going to start basically getting our texture on the rock. So I don't think this has necessarily worked as much as I'd like, especially the tools I tried to use, but we'll just go through it anyway. So to start with, I'm going to get a slightly lighter color. I think it's one of the lighter grays, ghost gray probably, or something like that, maybe wolf gray, and we'll put some of it on the palette. So yeah, I want to try and emphasize a lot more texture on the rocks, so we're going to try and capture some of that by actually painting it in ourselves. Or myself, rather. So to start with, get some color on the palette. Anytime you're ready, mate. Alright, and we'll get this, basically it's a foam sponge brush. So we'll just get it in, nicely, loaded with paint. And what you can see me off doing there is, just off to the side, just tamping it down a bit on a bit of towel to remove some of the excess paint. And we'll just be very careful, just starting to stipple on that texture around the larger areas of the base. In the end though, I found it more effective to basically stop using this thing and, what was I going to say, use a bit of packing foam. See, there we go, and some tweezers. Yep, sorry for the camera rocking, I was just getting tools. Because this provides us with a much smaller point, and as we're getting closer and closer to the feet, we're going to need this precision in order to avoid getting paint on the model. But of course, I didn't quite avoid that, as we shall soon see. So yep, there we go. So the first thing that you do, this is a good example of what happens when you make a mistake, is before you let it have a chance to dry, you immediately get a brush, you wet the surface, and then you start washing away the paint. If you let it go for a while, it'll actually start to properly cure onto the model, and then you can't really recover from it. You have to repaint it again. So it's good to be diligent when you're applying paint, no matter what. So yeah, this is pretty much it. We're starting to slowly get a more speckled pattern on the rock using a couple of different colors, and we'll gradually lighten up the colors that we use to get even more speckle going. So now we're using an even smaller brush. This one is just a roughed up Citadel base brush, a medium base brush. And we're just stabbing it onto the model, especially around the upper raised edges, because I do believe this was the my first highlight basically. So start focusing on the more sharp and jagged and rough areas where more light would catch basically. And I'm also doing this while the paint is still partially wet. This does help blend them in a bit, blend the two colors in together. But you just have to be careful because I don't want to blend them too much, otherwise you get one flat color. So it's a good idea to leave some areas of the model not fully mixed. I find, like, the final result, I think this worked quite well. Definitely better than I was expecting, but you know, you never find anything new until you try it out. So yeah, in this case, the experiment paid off pretty well, I think. Alright, now we're onto our serious highlighting. We're going for almost a white now, and we're just going to dry brush over all of the sharper raised areas to try and really catch those edges. Again, being very careful not to get this color on any of the other details on the model. This is a fairly short step because you want to be minimal with this dry brushing. That's the thing, the larger the model, the more subtle you want your highlights and shades to be in order to convince the viewer that it is a realistic, figure. The general rule of thumb I find is the smaller scale you operate, the sharper your highlights need to be, whereas they can be pretty stark on 6mm figures and still look good, whereas the larger they are, if they get too pronounced and too sharp, it just starts to really make the eye go, huh, that doesn't quite work. Anyway, so we're done with the highlighting more or less. Now we'll work on the shading. So the first stage is we want to darken this down a lot. So we're going to start with an overall wash. My usual wash mix in this case. Glaze medium is always the prominent factor in it, which really helps even out the color. But the colors we're using are an even mix of my base color. I do believe that's cold gray or shadow gray or something like that, and black. And so once we get the application, there we go. I'm just chucking it all over the model. I just really want to start ensuring that all of the deeper recesses are catched and all of the highlights are tinted slightly grey to give it that rocky look again. And again, be careful when you go close to the feet because, well, obviously if you're doing something similar, you don't want to have to go back and redo your previous work if you are a little too zealous with it. But for something to scale, you do have to do a bit more work to blend the feet in with the rest of the model to avoid the two pieces looking like they're contiguous. You need to work on that a little bit by really emphasizing the shades around those areas. Alright, so let's move on, shall we? So, how to continue your shading is pretty simple. Just keep adding black to the existing mix and you'll get progressively darker tones. So, once I am done mixing, any time now, buddy. There we go. I'm going to start being a lot more selective and painting this into the crevices to try and start really making them pop, especially against the highlights. So you can see those large crags and cracks on the rock. We're going to run our wash into them and really try and emphasize those details. Obviously, this is the one point where you, the general rule with using your brushes is you want to use the largest size you can get away with. But due to the runny nature of washes, you might want to go down a size just to avoid catching the edges a bit too much, because I did do that a bit at a few points and I had to go back and clean that up. Anyway, I'm moving right along. So you can see me working that shade color in and around the feet. This is a pretty important step, I believe, because like I was saying earlier, you really want to make sure that the viewer believes that the feet and the rock aren't like two pieces of molded resin. You need to really blackline it basically to make sure they're distinct. So this is why I'm getting an even darker mix of the wash and I'm just running it along the feet. And if I feel it's gone a little too far, I'll clean that up a little bit. So yeah, and again, I'm going to keep on progressively darkening it and working those details. So yeah, this is actually quite a departure from, you know, what you see on Games Workshop and stuff, where you're not particularly controlled with your wash. With this, you can add and take away wash, but the thing is, you have to basically do it and be satisfied with the result and then let it dry. So you're basically, there's an inflection point where you take a step back and say, yes, this is done. I can like let this set properly. You basically have until that point to work the wash as much as you can. You can always use a bit of water and a bit of like deft brush work and to, you know, like use the capillary action of the brush to soak up your excess. Anyway, so there I'm just adding in some more even darker shades to the cracks because, you know, again, drive that contrast as much as you can. Alright, so the base has been left overnight to dry because if you're using glaze medium as a mixing medium, that stuff, it will extend your drying time by like a factor of 10 to 50, I reckon. Anyway, so moving on to some of the effects. In my previous videos, I intentionally didn't do a great job on the neck stump of our decapitated head there because this is what I was going to do to it. The color I'm using is the GW Technical Blood for the Blood God. And I'm just gonna like paint some on the stump to make sure all of the crappy details are covered up and just put a little bit around the edge. And I'm also gonna put a little bit on his lips and mouth to, like, you know, emphasize like he's been like bleeding out of his mouth after, you know, getting his head lopped off by this psychopath with a large axe. Anyway, so if I was a better painter, I could probably do something like use drops of super glue to get dripping gore and like that, stuff like that. But honestly, I was feeling a bit lazy and I've got a lot to get through, so I'm just going to stick with something that's cheap and works relatively well. Other products you can use for this are, of course, Tamiya Clear Red, which apparently works really well, especially with that like super glue drop technique. That's basically how you do things like that. Anyway, and I'm also going to put a bit of a smudge on the axe, obviously, because you don't decapitate somebody without getting your axe all dirty. I was also planning on doing a blood splatter on the model itself, like she got hit by some residual gore, but honestly, I tried that out as a paper first, and I didn't quite really like it, and it's really is one of those steps where you have no idea if it's going to turn out good or not, so I wasn't brave enough to do it. But anyway, this is what I'm doing with the axe. I am, again, stippling it on with a bit of blister foam, basically. And just trying to get a fairly rough pattern, just, you know, to make it attractive to the eye. And try to get it in roughly the exact same spot on both sides of the axe. Like, you know, obviously it's gone through this unfortunate chap's neck in exactly the same spot on both sides. So you really want to try and sell that for multiple angles. But yeah, anyway, that's about the extent of my special effects with this character. Yeah, she's pretty much done. So let's move on to the final result. Well, some of the real final finishing touches. Okay, so now I don't normally do this because I'm terrified of it, but I'm going to just put I've already done the eyes in a previous video, but I'm going to try and enhance them by just doing a small pinprick of reflected light in the top right corner of the eye. I didn't think it necessarily made it look any better because the effect of the eyes, I didn't quite get them to the standard I was hoping, but it was worth giving a try. I was also using my Optivisor for this because that is about the event horizon for me for detail, is doing multicolor eyes basically at this scale, like, you know, the pupil, iris, and so forth. I definitely can't do it in 28mm figures, and I have immense respect and jealousy for the people that can. And this is the part where I notice, of course, once I spin it around again, come on, that the cloak isn't quite done. Let's skip to that part. Alright, So basically the cloak was completely not painted in the spot where I'd mounted the entire head assembly to a piece of cork. So let's just quickly go and correct that. I'm just getting a fairly dark blue, just going to cover all of the bare plastic up, and then that's that. And then I'm basically going to blend on the model a couple of colors up just to disguise the starkness of the transition between those colors. So any minute now. Of course, clearing a quick jam, such as it is. I usually use a paper clip or whatever's small and on hand for this. And there we go. Now, I mix that in with that original base color, and I'm just going to blend it while it's still drying on the model. And I'm going to keep working this in until I have reached the point where I've more or less decided that that ugly spot has been concealed. Alright, now for our real finishing touch. In order to make the base a little more interesting, I'm just going to stick some some dead grass growing out of the cracks. So just, using a bit of tweezers and with a bit of patience, just sticking them in there. Obviously do your best to try and, doing my best rather, to try and disguise the transition and make them look like they're growing up out of the rock. So it means basically just pushing them into the cracks and, yeah, just making sure the PVA is only minimally on the surface. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll stick the tufts in and let them dry, and then we'll move on to the final basing. Okay, so I did it off camera, but that's pretty much it. I just basically took her off the base, some super glue on the rim of the rock, and stuck her on a pre-made plinth from Andrea Games. And overall, I think I'm going to enter it in my secondary comp, not my main, well, not the main, and just see how I do. Anyway, I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.